Cargo Chief, we're a software company. Our main tool is C4, which you should be able to see here on the screen share. It's a project and procurement tool that really helps companies pre-book more freight, expand their carrier base, price competitively, and automate where it counts. I think there are a lot of redundant tasks today that not a lot of companies automate, or maybe they're still hitting the phones really hard and emailing carriers individually, where there are a lot of tools out there like C4 that can help you do a lot. I would say not just automating that outreach, but drive in carrier engagement, driving in more options, and helping you pre-book at the end of the day. So now thinking a little bit about, I guess, your company and kind of where you are. One of the main things is to think about what your coverage strategy is. And what that means is really like what goes into covering a load for your business. Do you have, a cradle to grave model? Do you have a split model where you have like carrier reps, customer reps, account managers, pricing teams? How are you covering that freight, both from, a customer perspective, like getting revenue on the books and new customers, but also like your procurement strategy too? And then maybe thinking about like, how much spot freight do I have? Do I have a home for this freight? Do I have a place where this freight can just live? Once my customer team wins it, what happens next? Like what literally happens? Is that load EDI'd? Is it built manually? What happens, right? And then I think when you think after that load is built, is there a centralized place for your team to recall those carriers, those core carriers? I think a lot of times when we talk coverage strategy, a lot of companies will say, well, first we go to our core regular carriers, exhaust all those options, figure out who's available, who's not. Then second, they're going to their lane history, which is a great place to go to if your TMS allows you to do that quickly. But after you get into your lane history of covering that load and finding out who ran it last month, last week, the last load, by the time you get to that, like maybe second, fourth, fifth carrier, maybe the phone rings and then your procurement team is pulled out of that workflow. So at that point, it's really like, the secondary, tertiary source of just posting and hoping, right? A lot of times companies don't really get the chance to get really into that second layer of lane history, and it just goes straight from core carriers to posting. And yeah, load boards are great for load exposure and just driving in new carriers, but it shouldn't be the source that everyone relies on. So when you think about your coverage strategy, think about how much time goes into covering that load, how much chaos can happen, the risk of taking a new carrier without having a conversation with them, making sure your freight fits their business. And I think the next thing is what your pricing strategy is. When you're using a procurement tool, it's not just about coverage. It's everything. I like to use the example of like a construction job or something that requires raw materials. If you're talking about building an apartment complex, procuring for that job, you're going to be looking at different contractors. You're going to be looking at different prices of materials. Those contractors are going to be bidding for you. And then you're also going to be thinking about timeline, right? Like how long is it going to take to actually build this with this contractor versus another? And procurement and capacity is similar to that. Your carriers are your contractors and your lifeline, pretty much. They're going to be the ones who are the face of your company doing the work. And then you've got a pricing tool where you're pricing out, what's that lane going for? What should that cost to be? And so I like to think about procurement in that way. It's not just about carriers. It's also about, pricing and how it fits in your business and with your customers' freight. Then I would think about kind of like, what tools are you using to help you overcome those big challenges, whether it's like pricing. Maybe pricing is just all over the place and it's really tough to do. What are you doing differently to price competitively versus the next company, next broker in Chicago, right? Like what's going to be different about your quote that you're giving rather than just a number that everyone gets from the same source. And then I think, also capacity and that other side of the business, like what are you doing to make sure that your carriers are being retained, that carrier retention is at the forefront, but also while keeping your service levels high. So there's those kind of three things I would really try to think about before you're looking at C4 or just any technology in general when it comes to procurement. Again, what your coverage strategy is, what your pricing strategy is, and what tools you're using to overcome those big challenges and hurdles. I really want to break C4 into kind of four pillars here. The first one is capacity. The second is pricing, and then procurement being third is kind of where we position care relationships and that long-term strategy, not just with carriers, but also pricing. And then fourth being automation, kind of bringing everything together, which we have a few ways to do. And I'll talk about that here shortly. So getting into capacity, this is going to be, a similar thing to kind of what you're searching for. There are a lot of jobs for different users, right? Like some people will come in wanting to find carriers for specific lanes. So capacity is really geared towards that. But you can also find a quote this way too. So if your job for that day, for that particular 5 minutes of time is trying to get a quote, this is how you can do that as well. So I'm just going to type in an origin destination pair. I think Atlanta to Miami is probably a good one. Here you can select your trailer types. I've got a pretty big pool here. The more carriers you have, the better it fits our database, and we'll be able to kind of scrub through your data and find out who runs step decks, who runs Conestogas and RGNs and things like that. One of the key differences I would say with C4 is that we weigh the pickup date pretty heavily. As the freight moves, it's tough to make decisions on delayed information, whether that's your carriers or pricing. So we look at pickup date as one of the driving forces and what your next decision is going to be. So here you can select today, tomorrow, next 7 days, even a date out further than that if you want to look at pricing or carriers. I'm just going to click search here. So focusing on this capacity side first, being that first pillar again, one of the key differences with our list is really the list itself. With a subscription in C4, what we'll do is we'll map your carriers to C4. That'll call out which of the guys are set up with you, ready to go, complied, and in your network already, making quicker targets for whenever you are trying to find that next fit. And kind of the difference here versus lane history is that a lot of times you might run Gables transport on one certain lane and you've never ran them on another lane like Houston to Atlanta. The difference with our database is since we have all that lane information on a carrier like Gables, you'll be able to see all of that lane history, and not just lane history, but as well as lanes that this carrier likes to run, giving you more insight into that internal routing network with that carrier. So every call, you're not just focused on one solution. You can actually, book more freight rather than just one at a time. And that's really what C4 is about. It's positioning those carriers for strategic long-term relationships, as well as, booking more in volume rather than one load at a time. Regarding the list, one is we'll map your carriers. So you'll be able to see those guys in bold text with a network icon. And then you can go outside your network if you don't have anyone that fits, or maybe it's a new lane for you. You'll also be able to find other carriers outside of your network. We've got over 600,000 carriers. That's growing rapidly. I think our outreach is something like 2,000 to 3,000 new carriers every week. So we have found a way to do that at scale, I would say. And some of the things about capacity or one of the main questions is, where does our data come from? Comes straight from the carrier. It's kind of two ways. One is through the onboarding process, we'll weed out the active carrier, who's inactive, who's a bus driver, but then we'll also weed out that everywhere carrier. I think a lot of times with like your load boards, you get an everywhere carrier. When you call them and you offer a load to Florida, they actually want Tennessee or shorter miles or whatnot. So we really prioritize that top fit, the right fit. So you're not having to go through 50, 60 calls where you're more, and I think on average, it's like 1 in 4 calls, you'll find a carrier that's willing to work with you at a fair rate. And that's the other difference here. A lot of these carriers are less opportunistic rather than a load board carrier, where here you can actually find the guys that run lanes daily. They run it 5 times a week, making it a better match for your freight. The kind of onto the second pillar here, with the pricing part. The current rates here, what we show, it's actually not an average. We get that question a lot. Is it an average? But it's more so a forecast prediction based on all the transactions that are coming through. So transactions meaning not just historical loads. It could be loads like last week, yesterday. It could be current rates today, but also loads in the future. Since C4 focuses on processing loads as they're booked, a lot of people are pre-booking freight. So with our TMSs and our C4 users, as soon as a load is booked, let's say it's booked today for a load picking up next week, we'll actually process that transaction, and the model will impact or react based on every record that's booked. Depending on the lane, if there's a lot of volatility, it could change, swing up or down based, again, on the pickup date. So it gives you a much more active and dynamic way to look at pricing rather than just using historical data. The other way too here is recent transactions. We'll actually give you insight into what loads are being booked. We won't show any like what broker, what carrier, but you do get insight into what loads are actually being booked for, and how far and how relative it is to your search. So here, for example, today's the 24th. Like I said earlier, a pre-booked load. We've got one here for picking up tomorrow. There's no better rate than actually seeing what that load is booked for. You don't have to forecast, you don't have to predict, you don't have to guess. It's right here, telling you 2,200 bucks. This is what someone paid to pick up a load tomorrow. So that gives you a lot more insight into when you're either quoting or you're trying to find a fair carrier to move that lane for you. We also do have these RFP imports to where you can kind of upload, with your bids that you get, upload up to 500 lanes at a time. We'll also kick back a CSV to you with up to 500 lanes and rates. It usually happens less than 5 minutes or so. So it's pretty quick. So that way you don't have to go load by load, pricing out your freight. The next thing I want to move on to is procurement. And this is where kind of your carriers and your pricing come together. And how we do that is with a tool called projects. The projects are listed over here as well. There's several ways to build projects, and uniquely with our subscriptions, we do have live support and training. We have a really good help center that's 24 hours. You can access that with tips and documents and different things like that. But we'll also guide you through more of a consultative way in how to book freight a different way, as well as mimicking kind of what your account's going to look like, what it should look like, and walking you through the setup process. With projects, again, this is kind of where you associate your lane rather than a load. So I think a lot of times today, and even pre-COVID, I guess, a lot of companies were writing things down on sticky notes, notebooks, in this isolated way of gathering information. But C4 gives you a way to pull all that stuff together. So let's say you build a project based on an origin destination pair. You got your project name, you can set your customer name, then how often you run that lane. Maybe it's 5 times a week. You can set that volume here. You can also set commodity and add a few notes if you wanted to through shipper notes, or even assign a user. Let's just say I'm going through this list and I'm trying to find different carriers for a different lane, or maybe one I've already got. I can click here, log my conversations, take notes on this carrier. I can say 1 star if the guy was like, hey, don't call me again, lose my number. Or 5 stars, like maybe this is a good carrier I want to work with. So once I leave my note, I can actually drag and drop this carrier over to my project. And I can do that with any carrier that I reach out to, giving you a quick way to associate these carriers as you're reaching out to them. So now once you go to your project, whenever that load does come up, it'll take you to kind of 2 lists. One, a recommended carrier list if you still want to find more carriers, or you'll have this procured pocket carrier based list. Now this list is kind of like your core carriers, but it can also be your carrier leads. Some pitfalls with a TMS is that you don't really have a way to associate an interested carrier. It's really just a carrier that has actually hauled the load for you. So if a carrier calls in, maybe they're not the right fit that day. Maybe they're getting empty a little bit later, but here's a way that you can actually access, the entire database. If a carrier calls in, I'm just going to pick La Jolla here, and I can add them to that project pretty quickly, just with a click. Let them know like, hey, it doesn't work out this time, but I'll give you a call next time we get that freight. So the next thing is actually automating your outreach. And this is kind of the first part of automation. Eliminating your individual emails to carriers. You can just click this button here and we'll actually send out an email to all your procured carriers. And that more or less stages the capacity for you. Take a sip of water real fast. So once you click that button, instead of having to email these guys individually, we'll kind of like send an email, stage this capacity for you. Any replies coming from that carrier will go straight to your inbox, streamlining all that communication for you. So a lot of carriers at this point will say like, hey, yeah, I've got a truck for Thursday. Here's my rates. And what you're able to do then is, you're going to have this load. You just might not have scheduled the appointments yet. So rather than waiting to call or finding that time, you can just click this button and it'll expedite that communication. The next thing is again, moving into that fourth pillar of automation. Some of the things that you'll be able to do with your data is actually look at an actionable report. I think a lot of times some TMSs, their reporting is, maybe it takes a little bit to get to, or maybe it takes a couple buttons to customize what you want to look at. Then what happens is a lot of people just click to the end and then they'll analyze it for an hour. And then they'll have to make a decision after an hour-long meeting. So what our scorecards and reporting does for you is it lets your team or whoever's ready to make improvements, it allows them to do that and take action with their reports. So some of the things, this is a lane report, for example. Let's just take a look at this Davenport to Clayton. It's a lane based, but you can also look into the loads. A lot of times you'll have cross customers on the same lane. So we give you a way to look at it from a lane level instead of a load level. So here, if I'm looking at a load to carrier ratio, 47 to 41, that means almost every time I get this load, I've got a new carrier. Not good, right? Like, so thinking about procurement in a long-term strategy, click into that load count and you can actually see your carriers. The goal isn't necessarily to like be the cheapest, but maybe you want to find Walker Transport. He's only taking one load with you. Maybe offer him 5 loads and see how many he can take at 1,800 rather than paying LB Independent 2,300, right? So it's giving you much more information in a way to actually procure carriers without too much legwork. When I go back here to the lane report, another thing that we'll show you, since we have our own pricing engine, we'll look back at the forecasted buy. We show that you paid 85 grand. Based on our current market data, when that load was picked up, you should have paid 64 grand. So roughly left about $24,000 on the table. So there's plenty of room for improvement there. The next thing that we guide you to do is to actually build a project. And that's where everything starts, back with procurement. Moving on to the last part here, I'm going to just click a lane here. This is where our last piece of automation, the digital freight matching part. Our tool is called the Booking Assistant. And what that does is, as soon as your load is built, and you don't have to be integrated, you can actually do this here in the platform as well. If we're not integrated with your TMS, the best way is through integration. But here, once your load is built, we'll match your carriers and your network to our database, making sure the lane checks out, frequencies there, and we'll actually offer that load out to you. I think a lot of times, kind of what I was saying earlier in the conversation is, a rep sometimes, by the time they get to their 4th, 5th carrier, the phone rings and they're dealing with a carrier fall off. What C4 will do is help you reach that 7th, 15th, 20th carrier in your database, as well as reaching out to carriers that match ours, to give you, your best options, driving in that carrier engagement. At this point, once that load is offered out, carriers, for whatever reason, still favor that phone call and conversation over any sort of technology. Clicking 1, 2, 3 times is 2, 3 more clicks than a carrier wants to do. So how we position ourselves is right where they're used to doing business, right there in their inbox, and where carriers don't have to log into a portal. We don't change the behavior for that carrier. and they're able to reply back to you with options, right? So once this load offer goes out, carriers will start to reply back and say like, hey, I can pick it up next week or tomorrow, or I can pick it up at 5, or send it over, or can you do 1,200, or can you do 1,400? And what that's doing is prioritizing your next decision. So you're not spending hours on load boards, figuring out what load do I pre-book, what load do I work on, who do I call, and when do I actually do it. So this is really expediting that pre-booking process. Typically, if you have, I don't know, maybe 5,000 carriers in your network, you'll probably see around 15-20% carrier engagement. We've seen upwards of almost half. Some of our customers have, I don't know, 15,000 carriers in their network, where they're seeing more like 40% carrier engagement. And that's without their team having to do anything. As soon as your load gets built, the load offer shoots out, and they're able to start pre-booking much more effectively, rather than having to think about what load to work on, who to call, and just things of the business. So with that, some common questions that we usually get is, how much is it? How much does C4 cost, right? So it really depends on your network, the size of your network. We look at it more of like from a marketing perspective, where it's like, we look at things like open rates, reply rates, click rates, those things that really count to drive that carrier engagement. So it really depends on your carrier network, and then your load count as well. So all of our subscriptions have unlimited users, so you do get this whole system, everything I showed you today, with every subscription. The price just really depends on your business, and as you grow, we'll grow together, and you have a really good, nice spot as far as our tier 1 introductory plan, to start using C4 and start pre-booking more. Since I have this pulled up here on this list, if you find a carrier that's not set up with you, and you have my carrier packets, you can just click that onboard link, click confirm, and that'll shoot that packet over. So that way you don't have to copy paste these things and send it over. So, and again, with our subscription, you'll have access to, we'll kind of go over everything, how to build projects, best way to do it, how to get your carriers here. There's a lot of things you can do yourself too. A lot of companies like to just take ownership and do it. You can invite users straight from here. You can exclude carriers if you didn't want to see certain carriers here. You can do your bulk imports for your RFPs and a lot of other things here. Feel free to come here to our website, cargochief.com, and click schedule a demo. It's a brief form. If you want to catch a demo, we don't happen to reach out to you in time, and go ahead and go to our website and click that schedule a demo button right here, and that'll get you set up with one of our reps on our team. So thanks everyone again, and y'all have a good